It was just Steve Jobs being a dick for like 2 hours. I mean, kinda. Not really. Actually, let me just explain. So this movie is different from the Ashton Kutcher telling of Steve Jobs' career in the sense that instead of focusing on the grind from the garage to the top, it focuses on 3 separate product launches, all of which are central to Steve Jobs' career. The movie starts with the release of the first Macintosh in 1984, and then it moves on to the release of the next computer in 1988, which was when Steve Jobs was no longer with Apple. And then you go 10 years in the future to 1998 with the release of the original iMac. And by exploring all the different product launches from his perspective, we see a lot more of his unfavorable sides. There are a lot of scenes that happen backstage right before each presentation begins, and so we get a good glimpse of just how cruel and unforgiving Steve Jobs could be to his peers and the people around him. So I'm not gonna lie, like the first 3/4 of the movie is just really Steve Jobs being a dick to people who he really has no reason to be a dick to. They bring in the Wozniak character and he consistently just shuts down any request that he has for him because Wozniak's thing is he just wants Steve to acknowledge the Apple II at every single presentation. But every single time he puts this simple request, Steve always has a reason to say, no, we're not acknowledging the Apple II, and they just go back and forth for like 5 or 10 minutes at a time arguing about the same thing like 3 separate times in the movie. And then at the very end it's like, oh, he's not a dick, he actually loves his daughter, and then the music shifts and it's like super uplifting and feel good happy music, and then you're like, wow, Steve Jobs, what a man. And then you pull out your iPhone and you just look at it and you think, wow, none of this would have been possible had it not been for Steve Jobs being a massive... But I think that's what this movie did a really good job of, because instead of portraying Steve Jobs as this flawless mastermind behind Apple, they showed him for who he really was, a rude piece of shit. Which I think is the goal of most biopics, because when you write a story about a non-fictional person, the goal isn't to sugarcoat and glorify everything the person did. The goal is to accurately show how the person was and not just reinforce the ideas that they represent, even if the person was a dick. And I think that's something this movie did really well, because they could have easily just made it a super inspiring story that tells the events of Steve Jobs and his fearlessness as he overcame every obstacle that came in his way. Like, those obstacles weren't even obstacles. They were just people saying, hey, stop being super condescending, and Steve Jobs saying, no. Every interaction looked a little something like this. Steve Jobs, acknowledge the Apple II. No. Please? No. Please? No. Please? No. Please? Like, yeah, Steve Jobs was a visionary, and he is the reason we have a lot of the technology we have today, but he was also super arrogant and condescending. But aside from all that, I thought it was super cool that they included Steve Wozniak, who's played by Seth Rogen, and they gave him such an important role in the movie, because instead of having him as this side character who's just the sidekick next to Steve Jobs, they sort of used Wozniak to shed light on how much of a dictator Steve Jobs was within the Apple sphere of things. And showing that side of Apple's history demonstrated a lot of maturity on the filmmaker's part. Because there's a certain level of ignorance that comes when you deliberately choose to leave out a part of a story, even if it's not super appealing or easy to watch. So let's get into the acting. It had Kate Winslet, Michael Fassbender, and Seth Rogen playing more of the important characters as the story of Apple developed, which, by the way, Michael Fassbender and Seth Rogen, I never would have thought I would have seen them in a movie, but both of their performances were phenomenal. It was like everything they did and said was super professional and well delivered. Like, yeah, Seth Rogen is the typical stoner guy of Hollywood, but if you give him a role where he wants to play a serious character, he can do it. Like, the dude has some acting skills. There were almost a few moments where I was like, oh, is he gonna do like the Seth Rogen laugh? And then he didn't. He was completely serious, and I was like, oh, yeah, this is it. And it was cool to see Wozniak's character develop from the beginning of the movie to the end, because at the very start, he's just this kind of goofy, awkward guy who's constantly asking for Steve Jobs' respect and acceptance, but by the end he learns to stand up for himself, and he does it in a way that's not on Steve Jobs' terms, because in Steve's head it's like it's a dog-eat-dog world, and Wozniak came in and he was just like, I'm gonna be a decent guy and not be an asshole back to you to get what I want. Michael Fassbender did a really good job, but I mean that was expected because he's Michael Fassbender. I can't quite put my finger on how he did it, but something about like how he carried himself, and I don't even know, something with how like his mouth was slightly open but closed. I don't know. It was just very like Steve Jobs to me. And his speech patterns and the way he like overpronounced every word he said, it was like he perfectly captured the essence of Steve Jobs. Oh, also, this movie had a lot of just quotable lines. Like there were a lot of scenes where two characters would be arguing, and then you have the one line that like stops the argument dead in its tracks, and it's always this like super thought-provoking drop the mic type line. Like there were a few times I actually pulled out my phone and I was like, oh, I should write that down. And one other thing, so a super rational concern I had going into this movie was, because I'm not super versed in Apple's history or anything, I wasn't sure if I would fully understand what was going on when it was happening, but this movie was able to provide enough context and exposition in a way that wasn't super on the nose or in your face. Without giving too much away, anytime they had an argument where the two characters would reference a certain thing or event that happened, they would have scenes from that thing they were referencing woven into the argument, and the flow of it was just so natural that you didn't even notice it was there almost. It was kind of like you already knew what was going on by watching it at the same time, if that makes sense. But yeah, overall, the movie was put together really well. The acting was great. I mean, I love seeing Seth Rogen when he's not being Seth Rogen in a movie. And it accomplished what I think is the goal of most biopics. It showed Steve Jobs, not for who he represents or how people want to think of him in their heads. It showed him for who he actually was as a person. Yeah, kind of a dick, kind of a control freak, but he has a daughter, so he has feelings, kind of. I'm sure he's not that bad, like if I actually got to know him. Actually, I'm not sure about that. But anyway, yeah, I would give Steve Jobs a 9 out of 10. It was definitely better than the Ashton Kutcher Jobs in 2013, and you should go see it. Let me know what you think. If you agree, disagree, whatever. Later.